And welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to the fastest growing segment of our society. To those of you who, like me, know that there's something troubling, even destructive, about religion and politics, media reporting, military invasions, and economic schemes. We realize that these institutions are part of the problem. They are not the solution. So instead of merely presenting the news, our mission will be to understand what is causing the tragedies that are besieging our planet, while predicting how these events will influence our world if we don't stand up to them. And that is why in our second hour we're going to engage God on his terms through evidence and reason, since his guidance regarding his covenant provides hope, the only reliable response to an exceedingly troubled world. Words, wisely wielded, provide the answer for everything that ails us, from economic ruin to terrorism, from religious myths to political hypocrisy. Anytime over the next 2 hours, if you'd like to participate in this discussion, our toll-free number is 877-300-7645. Yesterday, we led with a story that was tragic. We were reporting that there were at least 20 and perhaps many more deaths as it related to the bulldozing of the demonstration camps that had been set up by supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout Egypt. And we had the Muslim Brotherhood saying, no, that number isn't right. The death toll is going to approach 800. And today, the Egyptian government is saying, yes, we will now acknowledge that the death toll isn't 20, it's at least 525, and there may be hundreds of bodies now in the mosques that have not been counted in our hospitals. It is a sign of something that I've been encouraging our listeners to evaluate, to consider now for many years. And that is when it comes to the problems that beseech our world, that with many of them, there are no answers. There's no good side. That when it comes to politics in particular, you ought not try to choose the lesser of two evils. That's why so many Americans have stopped voting, and I would encourage everyone to stop voting. You ought not side with the lesser of two evils. The argument on both sides of the aisle in America is almost equally condemning. And when you turn to Egypt, 525 people were murdered by the military government. 4,000 were seriously injured when they tried to eliminate anyone's right to protest against their dictatorship, their coup. Highlights the reality that there is no good side here. The President of the United States did a horrible thing some 6 years ago when he made a speech lying about Islam, telling Muslims that they had a great religion and that they had made positive contributions to the world, that their religion was peaceful. It was all lies, and he knew it. But what he did in that speech is he reset the stage. He said that, in essence, that, yeah, we understand that you have a military dictatorship here in Egypt with Mubarak. We understand there's military dictatorships, and there are, throughout the Islamic world, there are monarchies, and that the democracy needs to sing. Now, fundamentalist Muslims are wholly opposed to democracy because in Islam, Allah decides there is no free will, there is no choice. But what he said in that speech is that if Muslims rise up and claim what is rightfully theirs, that the United States would not side with those who would oppose them, that we would abandon the military government of Egypt, of Libya, that we might even arm and provide support for the Muslims who are rising up against these governments in Syria. That's what he said, and they did. And so we had a secular government in Tunisia toppled, replaced by the Ennahda Party, the most fundamentalist Islamic party in that country. And now those who were the lone voices for secular government, they have been murdered, silenced that way. We provided weapons for the Mujahideen, the jihadists in Libya, the same Mujahideen we were fighting and killing in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We then decided, no, now they're on our side. We ought to supply them with weapons. We did. They thanked us by killing our ambassador and 3 others. They are now the weapons providers for all of the fundamentalist Muslims in northern Africa. We then had an Islamic revolution in Egypt, where 65 to 70% of the people voted for the most fundamentalist Islamic parties, who once in power did what Muslims do, tried to impose Sharia law. The military then launched a coup. The United States government officially, because of Obama, said we support the Muslim Brotherhood, that you need to turn power back over to the Muslim Brotherhood immediately. We couched it in return power to the freely elected government. And then he said in his letter to Sisi and the military, and do not incarcerate or harm in any way the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, for those who say, well, the military was right because the people rose up against the Muslim Brotherhood, be careful. Millions did rise up against the Muslim Brotherhood. That is true. Egypt is a country of 80 million people. 10% are Coptic Christians. They were being slaughtered with the rise of power of the Muslim Brotherhood. And about 20% of Egyptians are bad Muslims. They're secular Muslims. In other words, they have the potential to be thinking and good people. That 30% amassed about half of their numbers, and they protested against the theocracy and Sharia law that was being imposed against the Muslim Brotherhood. And the American-trained General Sisi that Morsi had empowered turned against him. And now we have a military coup. And this is not even a military that is as kind, if we want to use that term, as Mubarak's. They mowed down and killed at least 525 people. The number will probably rise to closer to 1,000, with 4,000 seriously injured. There is no good side. There is no solution. And the United States and the rest of the European countries who claim that they had brokered a compromise between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military, and therefore the compromise should have prevailed, do not recognize 2 things. One is that in Egypt, the United States and Europe are hated by both sides. We're despised by both sides. They know that we are not to be trusted, that we are duplicitous in our nature. And so we have no credibility in those countries. And so we can't broker a solution because we have 0 credibility. We're hated by both sides. And second, when you try to form an agreement, a treaty, as Kerry is trying to do now between the mythical people known as the Palestinians and the Israelis, that the Quran says in the 9th surah as it begins that any treaty between a Muslim and a non-Muslim is not binding on the Muslim, which means you are being played for a fool when you trade something tangible for promises when you're dealing with Muslims. If you were to give Muslims land for promises of peace, then it shows that you are ignorant. You're irrational. Well, the same thing would be true in Syria, where you say to the Mujahideen that are fighting Assad is a bad guy, the Mujahideen are worse, that if you take our weapons, which we will funnel through Qatar since we don't want our fingerprints directly on it, they'll dust off our fingerprints, then will you promise that when you topple Assad that you'll be nice? You'll play nice with others. Oh yeah, sure, give us the weapons. They're lying. But when you don't know who your enemy is, when you create this imaginary enemy known as terrorists, then you continue to do stupid things. And people die. You know, because of our invasion of Iraq and giving Iraq to Iran, the civil war in Syria has now claimed over 100,000 lives, creating a living hell for those people. It's a direct result of our invasion of Iraq. The militarization of the once peaceful protest in Syria is a direct result of Petraeus and his awakening strategy, which was part of the surge in Iraq, where we armed the Sunni Muslims, which is now the reason why Iraq has returned to civil war. We're making bad situations worse. It's time that Americans come to realize that the enemy, in this case, is Islam, not a corruption of the religion. They realize that Muhammad himself was a terrorist, that the Quran orders Muslims to fight and kill until the whole world surrenders to Allah. Now, that does not mean that we ought to go off and try to bomb Muslims into oblivion. That is the wrong response. When you're dealing with a religion, you cannot fight it with bullets and bombs. You make your situation worse. It means that there is no way for us to make a positive difference in the Islamic world. We need to pull out. Stop sending military hardware. Stop sending troops. Stop supplying weapons for one side or the other. Stop offering advice. Stop providing aid for countries like Pakistan, who is the primary state sponsor of terrorism. Stop sending dollars for oil for Saudi Arabia, which is the chief funder of terrorism. We need to disengage from the Islamic world. Step aside from it. We also need to recognize that our military has become counterproductive. Rather than protecting American freedoms, our military is being used in a way that is making Americans more vulnerable. These are not good things. When our country tries to justify programs like the NSA spying on Americans by saying that we picked up all sorts of this chatter not heard at this level since before 9/11, and therefore we're going to close all of these embassies because there's a massive terrorist plot that is about to hatch, and all we did is read a press release from Ayman Zawahiri to a website that he wanted posted, which is the essence of al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. And then we pretend like the sky is falling, all to justify the unjustifiable. It's time to step away. Hello, and welcome back to Shattering Myths. You know, one of the things that I'm trying to encourage here is I want our listeners to think, and I want our listeners to reach out to others that fall into this new growing mandate of recognition that the problem are our religious leaders and our political leaders, our economic leaders. They're the problem. They're not the solution. And to use their minds, use evidence and reason to get to the point where we don't just recognize that our government is lying to us, that our government is actually acting in a manner that's counter to our best interests, that we take that the next step and we understand what it is that they're doing that is so harmful so that we step away from them. And we turn to Yahowah, his covenant, for answers, and we'll do that in the second half of the program. But one just takes a modicum of time. Now, with Prophet of Doom, I invested 10,000 hours to systematically reorganize the 5 sources of material that tell us about Muhammad and the creation of Islam, around 600 of the Common Era. And I was able to use the Tariq, which is the history of Islam's formation by Tabari, the Sirah, which is the biography of Muhammad, collection of hadiths ordered chronologically by Ibn Ishaq, Muslims' collection of topically arranged hadith, and Bukhari's arrangement of of subject-oriented hadith. Hadiths are oral reports from Muhammad and his companions. The reality is that the Quran is also hadith. It's an oral report from Muhammad passed on by his companions. And by taking the traditional hadith collections, the only 4 compiled within 200 years of Muhammad's death, I was able to arrange the Quran chronologically and to set it into the context of Muhammad's life. And that's important because the Quran is a jumbled mess. It has no chronology and it has no context. And so when you set the Quran into chronological order, into the context of Muhammad's life, based upon what is known about him, and 100% of what is known about him comes from these 4 collections of hadith, Islam is an open book. It's obvious who Muhammad was, that he was a terrorist. It's obvious what Islam does. It kills. Nothing has changed. You come to realize that every cleric, every politician, every media spokesperson that says that our problem is with radicalization and extremists, you come to understand that they're either ignorant, or they're irrational, or they're immoral. Because that's the opposite of what's true. Every good Muslim is a terrorist. You can be a bad Muslim and be a good person. You cannot, according to the Quran and Hadith, be a good person and a good Muslim. Not by any moral standard, because Muhammad was a terrorist. Muhammad was a mass murderer. Muhammad was a slave trader. Muhammad was a kidnapper. Muhammad was an avowed liar. Muhammad was a rapist. He was a pedophile. Those are facts. And so when you have the evidence so overwhelming, so ubiquitous, so undeniable, and yet all those who really want to appropriately deal with the tragedies that are being perpetrated throughout the Islamic world that are affecting us because they fly planes into our buildings, because they pull out guns shouting Allahu Akbar and shoot individuals. That all you need to do to understand who they are and why they're killing, in addition to what you can do to stop them, is now to read Prophet of Doom. It's available free. Now, you can do the research yourself. You can validate the research that I've done, whatever you prefer to do. But for 50 hours, you can read Prophet of Doom from beginning to end, and you will understand exactly what this disease is and how it kills, how it destroys, why the Islamic countries are the most impoverished and violent and hellish places on earth, why they treat women so poorly. And then once you know that, then you can properly identify the grotesque immorality of your government for saying that Islam is not the problem, that we're not at war against Islam, that we're at war with al-Qaeda, which for the most part doesn't exist anymore and never was relevant, and that we're at war against terrorism. And you know that when they sacrifice lives and coin to fight this mythical enemy, that they're making a bad situation much worse. You come to realize that our invasion of Iraq was counterproductive, not only for the Iraqis, but for us. That our invasion of Afghanistan was counterproductive, not only for the Afghanis, but for us. And that somewhere along the road, you'll come to realize, you know, in addition to Islam being the problem, our government is the problem. Both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. And you'll do what Yahowah has asked. You'll step away from these things. You'll recognize that you ought not be loyal. You ought not try to choose the lesser of two evils. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I'm your host, Yetta. We have other news that shows that our government, our political parties are failing us. The United States ran a budget deficit in July that was $98 billion. I might say, oh, $98 billion. I thought our problem was in the trillions. Well, that was 1 month's deficit. If you were to take, let's round 98 billion to 100 billion, if you multiply that by 12, you'd have an annual deficit at about $1.2 trillion. Now, the deficit thus far this fiscal year is $607 billion in the red. That means that rather than reducing the size of the deficit, that we are continuing to add to it at a brisk pace. Now, think of that for a moment. This president and this Congress raised taxes appreciably on businesses and on working Americans, in the sense of the most productive Americans. They took the tax rate from 35 to 39%. They then imposed another series of taxes more clandestinely, and ended up increasing taxation. Then they couldn't agree on how to trim the U.S. government, so the sequester cutting of government was imposed, and it's in the range of $200 billion on an annualized basis. And yet, even with this, what is a fairly massive tax increase on the people that pay the lion's share of the tax anyway, combined with this, what we consider to be, it's not, but what we consider to be a massive cutting of government spending through the sequester motions, that we're still a year-to-date at $600 billion in red ink, adding $100 billion a month. We may come in this year under $1 trillion in additional debt, but the likelihood is the number will be at about $800 billion, and that's after $200 billion of cuts that really are not cuts. They're postponements of spending that bite us later. And after raising taxes on the most productive Americans. And so we go from $16 trillion in aggregate debt to $17 trillion in aggregate debt, one of only a handful of nations whose aggregate debt is greater than its annual gross productivity. We are in a irresolvable debt crisis, which is why continuing with any form of economic policy that is even remotely akin to what we have done to get us into this mess has no chance of prevailing. This is not an issue of, boy, if in the midterms we keep Republicans empowered in Congress, that this is somehow going to be better. You had Republicans controlling the Senate, the House, and the White House for a significant period of time where we were radically exacerbating this problem. And now with Democrats controlling two of those three branches, the problem just continues. It doesn't matter who's elected. We're bleeding ourselves to death. One of the reasons, of course, is just the grotesque waste of our government. I'm going to read a story that was posted on the Department of Defense's own website. They published the following on February 20th of 2002. So this is dated, but it was sent to me this past week. As part of military transformation efforts, Department of Defense Controller Dov Zakheim and his posse of accountants are riding the Pentagon's financial paper trail, seeking to corral billions of dollars in so-called lost expenditures. For years, DOD and congressional officials have sought to reconcile defense financial documents to determine where billions in expenditures have gone. That money didn't fall down a hole, but is simply waiting to be accounted for, according to the Department of Defense. The American Forces Information Service said that complicating matters, the Department of Defense has 674 different computerized accounting systems. I've run businesses. If you have more than one computerized accounting system, you're in serious trouble. And here the Department of Defense has 674 different computerized accounting systems. Is there any wonder that they have lost expenditures? Most of the 674 systems do not talk to one another unless somebody translates their messages between them. The situation, he added, makes it hard to reconcile financial data. Billions of dollars of DoD taxpayer-provided money hasn't disappeared, he says. It's just missing. It needs to be reconciled in some way. The bank closes out each month, and it sends a bank statement, and then you look at, well, you know, I've got some differences because maybe I forgot to write down that check, or I didn't properly enter that deposit, and maybe the bank misappropriated some funds. You know, it's just different than what I expected, he said. Well, you know how much money is missing in the Department of Defense? How much is missing? $2.3 trillion. It's kind of like our situation in Afghanistan, where President Bush thought, you know, the way to solve the problem in Afghanistan is with money. And he flew 10 or 12 cargo planes, C-17s, I believe, filled with $100 bills. Just cash. No accounting. If there's cash, there is no accounting. Man, you can bribe whoever you want to bribe. You can pay off whoever you want to pay off. You can fund any agenda that you want to fund, and there's no paper trail. And we sent a dozen C-17s loaded with $100 bills to Afghanistan. And what we ended up with is the most corrupt government on planet Earth. That's the government our troops died trying to defend. We heard in the beginning of the first hour that employers were laying off fewer people so that the unemployment benefits compensation checks decreased in terms of new filings this past month by about 1%. Well, at the same time, employers slowed their pace of hiring. So people slowed their pace of hiring, and you have fewer people claiming unemployment benefits, and at the same time you have the unemployment rate going down. You know, you just need to scratch your head and say, how is that all possible? You know, we have business hiring fewer people, we have fewer claims for unemployment benefits, and the unemployment rate drops. There's only one explanation for all of that, and that is that the people who were looking for jobs, and you have to be looking for a job to be considered unemployed, gave up looking. And the fact that they gave up looking means they're no longer entitled to unemployment benefits, and it means they're no longer considered unemployed. So we say that the unemployment rate is just over 7%, when in fact more than half of those Americans who are eligible to work in terms of the working age and physically fit and able to work, more than half of Americans that are able to work are not working. But rather than saying that our unemployment rate, therefore, is 50%, we lie to everyone to say, oh, what a wonderful job we're doing. It's down to 7%. And we release data that misleads for the purpose of confusing the audience. You know, the drop in unemployment was at the same time was due to a decline in the size of the U.S. workforce. In other words, fewer people claimed to be participating looking for jobs. And that's the reason the unemployment rate fell. It was out of desperation, people ultimately giving up. At the same time that they're announcing this as good news, the government also said that 26,000 fewer jobs were created each of the last 2 months than had been expected. It's the darker side. It's the truth about our economic situation. Turning to a related story, this is really hilarious. Many of you may have heard that Oprah Winfrey was having a conniption fit because she was the subject of a racist act in Europe, and therefore she says this is proof that Europe is still a racist continent. Now, I want to tell you, I have seen pictures of Oprah Winfrey without her makeup on. They're posted online if you've got the stomach for it. try it sometime to see what she looks like if she's not plastered over and made up for television. Now, being ugly is not a sin. It's not anybody's fault. I'm just going to tell you that who knows what Oprah looked like when she walked into the store, and you may want to check one of those pictures of her prior to being made up for her television show and the photo shoots to see what the appearance may have been as she walked into a store. But she walked into a really hotty-toss store in Switzerland. And there was a purse that was behind a locked display piece. You know, if you walk into a museum and you see this, you know, their crown jewel, and it's locked away inside of a case that has a key that it says, you know, this is a display item. Well, stores, really fancy stores, have similar things. They'll you know, you have a jewelry store and it'll have, you know, some just extraordinary over-the-top piece of jewelry that they'll lock in a single display so you can walk by and say, ooh, wow, that's gorgeous. Boy, if they can make and offer this kind of thing, this is a really hotty-toss store. And so in the midst of the store that she walks into, selling purses in Switzerland, they have such a purse. It is a $35,000 purse. $35,000 purse. And evidently she asked someone who doesn't speak English to show her the purse, and the person says, man, you don't want to look at that purse. It's a display item. I mean, come on. No, I mean, let me show you a purse that's really for sale. And she had a tizzy fit because she assumed that she was being treated in a racist manner by someone assuming because she was black that she couldn't afford a $35,000 purse. Let me tell you something. There's something desperately wrong with an individual who is interested in buying a $35,000 purse. Oprah Winfrey, rather than complaining that she was being treated in a racist manner in Europe and complaining about the Europeans, ought to look in a mirror and say, you know, there's something desperately wrong with me to even desire such a thing and to squander money so heinously in this way. Turning our attention back to the world that we broke, here's two stories, and I can even update them with one today. Car bombs ripped through the streets of Baghdad and throughout Iraq, killing 60 people. Then from Reuters, another 16 people were killed. 41 were wounded on Monday in a series of suicide bombing attacks. Today we learned that at least 16 people were killed. And many more were wounded in a wave of bombings throughout Baghdad. We really did a horrible thing in Iraq, not only for the Iraqis, but for the rest of the world. Yes, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, so was Mubarak, so is Assad. But when you replace secular dictators in these Islamic countries with democracy and empower the fundamentalist Muslims and the imams and the mosques, you create a far worse situation. And because of that now, we took a country that suffered very infrequently from terrorist attacks, and we made it ground central for terrorism. Several thousand people, almost 4,000 people, have been murdered this year in Iraq from terrorist acts. And if you look at the number of terrorist fatalities in the 10 years prior to our invasion, it was much less than what happens now over the course of 6 months. We made Iraq far more vulnerable to the very thing that we said we were going in to eliminate, to fight. And not only that, almost 1 million Iraqis died as a result of our invasion. We as a nation not only squandered the lives of 10,000 Americans, making a bad situation worse, we squandered $6 trillion of our children's money. That's the legacy cost of that failed war. And by invading Iraq, what we did is gave Iraq to Iran, which enabled Iran to continue to focus on its nuclear ambitions, free of having an enemy. Iraq used to be the enemy of Iran. Now it has no open enemy firing at it And those nuclear bombs will be deployed in America. It was counterproductive. It was suicidal. In addition to that, because of their added influence and their control of Iraq, Iran came to control Syria and Lebanon. They ended up killing the Christian leadership in Lebanon, and now Lebanon is also in a civil war, but between Sunnis and Shias. And the Syrian war is a direct result of not only our invading of Iraq, but us deciding that our exit strategy should be the awakening program, where we arm Sunnis because we had armed the Shias with the massive weaponry. So if we give small arms and the like to the Sunnis, they'll keep the Shias at bay. And they decided to militarize the uprising in Syria and turn that into a civil war. That's how the jihadists first emerged. And now we say that the turmoil in Iraq is because of the rise of al-Qaeda, when in fact there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq before our invasion. So if we were at war with al-Qaeda, then why is it that there was no al-Qaeda presence in Iraq before we invaded, and now we claim that they are rising in their influence, not only in that country, but they are the source of mujahideen in Syria? It's not difficult, of course, to be a Monday morning quarterback, to tell you that our invasion of Afghanistan made a bad situation worse, that we squandered thousands of lives and billions of dollars, to push the Taliban out of Afghanistan into Pakistan, which is a nuclear country, and that we enriched our enemy in Pakistan, trying to bribe them to play along with us in Afghanistan, making a very bad situation much worse in Pakistan, a country with nuclear weapons. And the moment we leave Afghanistan, it will be as if we were never there, except for the coin and blood we spilt. And the same thing is true with Iraq, but on a far bigger scale, because we gave Iraq to Iran and set in motion the Syrian civil war. When you do those kinds of things and you cause that much death and mayhem in the Islamic world, and you are the primary source of weapons, selling hundreds of billions of dollars of weaponry to them, when you are empowering killers, somewhere along the way, that stain affects your soul. And then you continue to lie about it and pretend that we're actually on the right side as opposed to having made bad situations worse. How long does it take before the nation itself loses its soul?